All right, 3, 2, 1. Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to have you all join together to work on planning today. It's going to be one of those rare opportunities for deep conversations and time to really do some thinking. So I'm really pleased that you can be together this afternoon. Some of your colleagues have been working as part of the Pre-K2 project. And before you get started with your planning, I'd like to provide you with some background information. How did this project get started, and what's the focus of the project? And so we began last June with an essential question, and that question is, why is it that pre-K seems to operate on its own or in a way that's not continuous with those other primary grades and the elementary school as a whole? In other words, why aren't we referring to our elementary schools as pre-K 5 schools instead of K-5? And so we began to look at this question and ponder it. And we use a technique where we ask the question, why, several times, because in doing so, it helps us to drill down and down and down. And so we decided, as a result of that drilling down, that one of the causes of that discontinuity is that we, as elementary teachers, don't understand our colleagues very well. That early education segment that's so critical to children's development and that we are so fortunate to have in our elementary schools, we just are not sure what is happening. In fact, our conversations got very specific. We are not sure what is happening, when it's happening, how it's happening, and how we can support one another. So it was with the very best of intentions that we wanted to pursue this project and figure out how we can get that continuity deeper and stronger so that we can support one another. So after we identified that root cause, we went to do some researching. And that researching came about in several forms. And the first piece that we took a look at was an article, and in the article, it talked about in the primary grades that there are about 5 huge nuggets, and that those nuggets need to be maintained and grown and developed across the primary grades. And so one of those nuggets that gets developed is seeing our teachers as decision makers. Another one of those nuggets was increasing the conversations between home and school. And so those premises led us to deep conversations into how do you do that and how do you do that? And so that we could begin to form some pieces that were the same among each one of those grade levels. An example of that would be, how are we going to extend that welcome into our schools to parents and increase communication? And so, again, we learned from one another about the different ways that individuals communicate. Our next step then was to explore the book, Developmentally Appropriate Practice. And that's a green book that the members of this committee brought with them today for the planning session. I strongly encourage you that before you begin planning, that you select a portion of one of the chapters and do some conversation around it. The chapters are divided, the ones that I've highlighted here, chapters 5, 7, and 9, they're divided into an example section, and then within that example, it talks about every aspect of the child. Because for developmentally appropriate practice, we want to make sure that we are addressing the whole child and all aspects of their development. So there's a section on artistic ability. There's a section on their physical abilities. There's a section on social, emotional, and so forth. And so if you're planning today for math, you may consult that section. If you are planning today for literacy, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that section. In that section, you're going to see a contrast between what is developmentally appropriate and what we sometimes revert to in the elementary schools. Not on purpose, but it just becomes a piece of our habits. So let me give you an example of that. So in the area of literacy, we know all students need to learn their letters and their letter sounds. And so in kindergarten, one of the recommendations is that the that the preschool alphabet be at eye level. That's actually true for preschool and kindergarten. So that traditional piece of maybe decorating your room with that ABCs up high, we just need to look at that. And so this section of these chapters has very specific pieces of information that just help to guide our planning. So again, I would encourage a look through at that. So as this group approached this research piece, we also determined that conversation wasn't quite enough. Reading the theory wasn't quite enough. We really wanted to see it in action. And so we did some observations in one another's classrooms. And we noticed in those observations different trends. Altogether, I would say there were about 6 different trends that we identified, but 2 came up to the top. And those 2 were, our day is jammed-packed, and as teachers, we feel a lot of pressure in covering topics, skills, and strategies. So we wonder, where are we repeating ourselves? Where are the gaps? And that is an absolutely beautiful set of questions that has to do with vertical alignment. Should this committee continue, that would be the next phase of our work. Another topic that surfaced to the top was play. And we noticed that as we went through the grade levels, there seemed to be less and less time for play. We wondered, was that a good thing? Was it a natural thing? Did it have to be that way? And then we also wondered, what the heck is play as you move through the grade levels? So today, before we get into that planning phase, I'd like to answer a couple of questions for you about play. I'd like to make a connection from play to workshop, and I'd like to challenge you that as you plan today to incorporate an aspect of play in your planning work. So, what's play? As I began researching for this presentation, I found tons and tons of definitions of play. And one piece of that continuum of play meant actually going to recess and engaging in physical activities that strengthened our bodies. And then another dimension of that play had to do more with the cognitive part. What does play help us to learn? The ultimate definition here we'll arrive at in just a second, but the huge takeaway for me was that this doesn't need to be a dichotomy, that play is a way to get to learning. It's not that we are either playing or we are learning. We're using play to get to the deep concepts and skills, essential understandings of each grade level. So what does that look like then if play and learning are integrated? So play is physical movement, but it isn't the movement alone. So if we are taking our kids out for more frequent recess breaks, or if we are allowing our students a brain break, those are all very positive things. I'm sure you've had experiences like I have where I've been working very, very hard on a project and leaving it sometimes for several hours or overnight and coming back to it can heighten my productivity. It's the same thing with kids. Our brains get saturated, we sort of need to shake things up, and so those pieces of physical movement are really important. But we have to be careful what we're calling movement. So if we say we're going to have our kids go to stations because that's movement for kids, I'm not sure how much impact that has on taking a few steps and going to a new location. It's not like that other piece where we're really clearing our brains and reshuffling the order in which we're going to do things to increase our effectiveness. So physical movement alone isn't play in the context that we're thinking of it today. It has to be incorporated as a part of the learning. So we'll get to a little bit more understanding of that in a minute. Play is choice. When we play, we make choices. We have choices to investigate and to explore and to try out. That's what makes choice. choice. But if we're using it and integrating learning, then our choice has to be with a purpose. In the art station, it's very typical for us to have all kinds of materials to mess around with. If we don't interject learning into that environment, we're not getting the power that we can. So if I teach the students that when you mix two colors together, you get a new color, and I start off with black and white, and I mix them together and show that that produces gray, I can show them a technique then for exploring what different colors come from the primary colors and so forth. I'm not expecting students to shade with that gray that I just showed them, but I am expecting them to start to navigate those primary colors, mix them together, and figure out that every time yellow and red are mixed together, you get orange. So choice is within a structure and always has a practice associated with it, or a piece of instruction, a teaching point. Active learning and inquiry is that third piece of play. Inquiry can be huge, and inquiry can be small. Inquiry means that as a learner, I've become so enamored in this process, so engaged, that there are just natural questions that come up for me. Not all of those questions are teacher questions. And so you see the other side of this is that the kind of opposite of that active learning and inquiry is when teachers tell. So let me give you an example that might happen in late kindergarten or early first grade. And the teacher is teaching students to pay attention to the nuances of letters. In other words, why is an N different than an R lowercase? And so she could tell. And she could make an N in front of the students and make an R in front of the students and say, now notice how much farther my little hump had to go down here to make that N than it did with an R. She could even highlight it. Now contrast that to inquiry. And in that case, the teacher would have given each one of the students or a group of students, small group of students, a pile of magnetic letters and then asked the students to sort. She could leave the sorting completely open. And so the students would sort them into piles, and as they were doing that sorting, she would come around and be asking, why are these letters together? Why are these letters together? She could name the sort. I want you to put all of the letters that have a short stick in them together. The purpose of this is for students to uncover for themselves what letters look similarly, which do not. They're learning the fine details of print. Those kind of experiences translate into being able to write an M when you want an M and not an N or a U like we've seen students do. So those would be the precursors to having those apply then in students' writing. Some of you listening to this have taken the class on word study. Word study is really based on inquiry. It is, why is it that these patterns of words go together? And we start that as early as kindergarten. So it is understanding, inquiry is understanding the purpose, the reasoning behind either a concept or a pattern inside of what students are learning. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear inquiry, I think huge. So today, as you know, one of the outcomes is you want to infuse play into your planning. Let me show you some strategies for doing that. I always think about when I'm going to try something new, there's a low prep way to do it, and then there's a very high prep way to do it. And while I haven't listed the medium or the moderate type of strategies that would need moderate prep, you know that that lies in there too, and you can be thinking of that. This is not an exhaustive list either. I've just provided a couple of examples here. I happen to know all of you sitting behind this screen, and you are all excellent teachers. And today's providing you with the time to think about what would be additional ideas for putting on these lists. So inquiry doesn't have to be big. Here's an example of how inquiry can be low prep. What makes inquiry is that there is a student question. Typically, that question comes about because of what they're learning. So, for instance, if we happen to be studying about the changes that some animals undergo and we're focusing in on a frog, then the inquiry piece would come up because the students are wondering more about frogs. That could be something very, very personal. For instance, why can't I find frogs in my backyard? Why is it that I've never seen a frog down by the lakeshore? And others could be as a result of doing some reading. So on the low prep side, to begin that opportunity for kids to think hard, to think critically, it can begin with one of these low prep strategies. In the first one here that I'm suggesting, it's taking a picture book or picture books that you're planning to use for a particular unit, like in quarter 3, and you are planning out your questions before you do the read aloud. If you're anything like me, when I'm asking questions, they tend to follow a pattern, and those higher level questions don't always roll off the tip of my tongue. So some of the skills that you're working on this quarter are summarizing. You're also working on compare and contrast and point of view. And so I have provided you with a packet, and in this packet are some sentence stems for point of view. So you could actually write some questions that are book specific using some of those stems, and then you're prepared for that as you go into the lesson. The next piece here is spotlighting your students. And it means that they have a chance to spill forth all that they've learned in the process of inquiry. So again, let's go back to that frog unit. And let's suppose that you've had several lessons that kids have read, lots of different books, and so now you're going to pull them all together. The nice piece about this is it's a bit of a community builder too, because it doesn't matter what book you've read, it doesn't matter what experiences you've had previously with frogs, everybody gets that spotlight for those 30 seconds. The spotlight typically is individual, but you could also make it part of your routine to be a small group. But the questions that get asked here would be from the teacher. And she might pose the question, what do you know about frogs? And the kids just have the opportunity to spill forth that knowledge. Another example of this is when we make it a question that's more metacognitive. And so a question such as, what did you learn about yourself as a reader? What did you do today to get over the hard parts? What did you do today to remember what you read? All of those questions are good no matter what grade level you're in. Those are examples of low prep inquiry. Higher prep inquiry. Higher prep inquiry would mean longer and more integration. And so any time that you're integrating, I think it takes just more time, at least the first time around. For project-based learning, again, the question is arrived at by the students. It is supposed to generate a project that's literally going to benefit folks outside of the classroom structure. So this is an actual project that happened over at Stoker, and it happened with the kindergarten classroom. And so what they did first was take a tour of the schoolyard, and they used some science skills as they were doing this, and they had little notebooks, and they recorded what they saw, and they drew pictures of what they saw, and they had some writing experiences where they were labeling what they saw, and then they had some conversation with what did they see, what did they notice, what did they wonder. After all of this, they noticed that they had some great trees growing there in the grass in front of their school, but it was a little plain. And so how awesome would it be if they could have something blooming year-round? Voila, the project-based learning was born. And so there were a ton of questions they had to answer. What plants do bloom? Do we need to look at shrubs? Are we going to find flowers all year long? So you can see how that relates to that kindergarten curriculum. In an inquiry project, it can be more contained, and there may or may not be that larger benefit the world project. Project-based learning, to me, is all-encompassing, whereas the containment of an inquiry project is possible. So, for instance, let's say that students were investigating the westward movement. So in third grade this particular quarter, students are studying historical fiction as they are in second grade through fifth grade. And in that process, they're exploring what it was to go west. So on a very literacy-based type question, it could be, what way did the authors most effectively show the hardships and the passion that these individuals had to move west? Because in the suggested reading material, there are books where the authors have used actual pictures. There are books that are written in letter form. There are books that are written as chapters of each one of the seasons. There are books written from the students' or children's perspective, and there are books that are written from adult perspectives. And so the project is pretty simple in the sense that we're going to have this question about authors and comparing and contrasting these books. Again, one of the strategies that is being taught this quarter. Another way to think about narrowing this and making it a little bit more prep is to have a collective theme or a question. So I'm going to skip down for just a second to one of the themes could be power. So in the example that I said before about going west, where is the author's power in each one of the ways that they write? What kind of power did the pioneer have over land? What kind of power did it take inside to make these people want to leave everyone and everything behind and move west? If you think that these are challenging questions, they absolutely are. Because what play does is allow us to go into an experience or a topic in a bit of a different way and to play around with it. It goes beyond those typical things that we do to make sure students know story elements and the other particular nuances of how stories work. It goes beyond that and allows kids literally to play cognitively. And so you see one more example there, and that's the philosophical theme. You as a teacher team could come up with this, such as, what does it mean to be brave? Again, in this quarter, most all grade levels are taking a look at biographies and historical fiction. In each one of those genres, there's lots of opportunities to cite bravery, to talk about, is it brave or crazy to move your family hundreds and hundreds of miles to a prairie where there's no home, where there's no store, where there's no people that can support them as they build their new life together. So you can, the whole purpose of that inquiry project is to play around cognitively with ideas. So let's go to an even more concrete example. But before we do that, let's think about where we started. Today we started with, what is play? Well, play means inquiry. Inquiry is questions coming from kids. And those questions come about because we've set the stage for those questions to rise to the top. We're not talking so much that we're delivering the information, the only information kids get. Kids are generating that information too from the experiences that we provide. So you're about to see an experience here on this little pink sheet. This experience is at the preschool level. But the question remains, if I'm allowing students to play, to do inquiry, am I also doing workshop, or have I departed that? I'd like to show you how closely inquiry and workshop go together. So once you take a look at this guided play to explore new words and their sounds, you know exactly why this teacher's doing what she's doing. She wants the kids to learn some new words, and she's going to mess around with letters and the sounds that they make. But she's going to do that in a way where she sets the context for kids to play and learn at the same time. So as you glance through this, you'll see that she reads a book to the students to kick this off, Sylvia's Garage. She introduces during that reading the key vocabulary, and that vocabulary is going to get repeated throughout the unit. This could be part of a larger unit on transportation or some other science-related topic. So she's doing a larger prep, if you will, a higher prep thinking through multiple subjects being integrated together. So after she's read this book, they've introduced this vocabulary, then she's going to tell the kids that we're going to set up a station where you get to be in a garage. We're going to set up a garage here in our classroom. What will we need to do that? And the kids then are generating the people, the things that would be part of that center. In addition, they're talking about what those individuals or what those things do. Okay, you see the vocabulary here. And then the next piece that's going to happen after they co-create that list, probably done during interactive writing, is they're going to put a label behind each one of them. And that label is going to indicate whether it gets made at school or whether it gets made at home. So it could be something that you bring in from home or you're going to make it at school, therefore the M and the H. Then, after the teacher has arranged for this to happen, the kids actually start the work. And as they're starting the work, it's going to be very natural for certain things to be labeled. And as that labeling happens, she's going to come back to her learning goal, which is to mess around with sounds. And so as students are working, in the case that's here in the example, the student's working on the word gas. She connects it to his name. She talks about a G. Again, this is side-by-side interactive writing. So how does all of that compare to workshop? I would say the lineup is pretty perfect. This particular example starts like all of our lessons in literacy do, with a read aloud. It typically is with a picture book. That picture book then is the kickoff for either a strategy, a skills-based lesson. In this case, it was the kickoff for a larger unit. That focus lesson that gets developed is going to be not as precisely stated, as intentionally stated at preschool as it is at the other grade levels. A focus lesson is simply the teacher stating what kids will know and be able to do at the end of their time with that teacher. So, in the case of Sylvia's Garage, they needed to know some words, because they're going to use them a whole lot. If this was being done with kindergarten students, we might say that what students would know and be able to do at the end of this is to identify first letter sounds and write them. If this was done at first grade, you might say the focus lesson after reading Sylvia's Garage was to be able to write a simple, to draw pictures of what you might see in a garage and label them. At this time of the year, they might have a short phrase or even a sentence that goes along with that picture. So you can see how you can take this same activity and allow it to grow developmentally with the students. There's writing in this lesson. In the case of preschool students, they're going to be doing interactive writing, and that would be true in many cases in kindergarten and probably until about this time in first grade. And so there's always a writing in response to the lesson, to what is learned. Then there's a place to explore and practice this on your own. Again, in this example, it's within a center. In kindergarten and in first grade, it could be within a center. In second grade, it probably is going to be in a book. So if we are working on the skill of author's purpose, author's perspective, then the fact that Sylvia's Garage is written about a woman, we could talk about why the author would write that book. And then we could have students dig into the books that they're reading during independent reading time or guided reading time and be looking for what that author's purpose, perspective was. What message are they trying to give in that book that goes beyond the words? Students will be needing support, all students, whether they function above grade level or not. And so that happens both individually, as you saw with Gary, who was writing gas in the example, or in your own classrooms, it's going to happen with small groups and their need for support and further extensions of their learning. And then finally, there was the actual making it part. This was the construction part. Now, I will tell you that personally, I can see the lineup between the infusion of play and workshop all the way through until this last one. It just gets a little trickier in my thinking. These individuals, the kiddos in preschool that were designing their garage, they were literally constructing it. As students move up to about the mid-year in first grade and beyond, I think that construction starts to be more along the lines of constructing meaning, both concretely and abstractly. But the idea is that we play with those thoughts. We play by putting them into different contexts. We play by putting them into a range of different books. We play with them by getting to talk to other individuals. We play with them by getting asked questions that we've never been asked before, that challenge us in a new way cognitively. As you are thinking about all of this, some of your past experiences with theme might be resonating. I know it did for me. What is the difference between my thematic-based teaching and standards-based teaching? And where does play fall into that? When I did my Apple unit, I had a great deal of fun with my kids, and we played, we constructed. My first graders made an orchard over in the corner, and we talked about different kinds of apples and different kinds of leaves, and we collected leaves from the gardens that were around school, and we had all kinds of science concepts that we explored by doing so. In literacy, we read apple books, and we made corresponding pictures and labeled them and showed the progression of an apple tree. And as we had all of this fun, and we certainly read, and we certainly did writing, I could not tie those to a specific skill or standard or strategy. What would have benefited my kids more in reflection would have been to have laid those out first. What do kids need to know and be able to do? And then how can these experiences support that? Because each little experience was sort of unto itself. It didn't necessarily connect to the others except through the word apple. So today, in your planning, as you're rising to that challenge of how will we infuse play, be also thinking, not also, it's the foremost thought, what do my students need to know and be able to do? That foundation, I think, is critical before you layer on then, how will my kids play both physically and cognitively with these concepts? What kind of activities can I structure so that I'm not telling all the time and they're doing some discovery? Well, I have a little tool for that. Whether you use this entire tool or part of the tool, the questions are really the most important part. And so I'm going to lead you through a few of them just to give you a little bit more background on them. So the first thing is, what are my students going to need to know and be able to do? Those are the essential standards. And while those are listed in every document, this really calls for the team to think about, what does that mean? When I say at first grade, students are going to understand author's purpose, what does that mean? This row is a bit deceiving because actually you would break it down into the 3 key learnings for the quarter. The curriculum is organized so that that's how it gets mapped out. There are typically 3 major skills or concepts that are pursued and learned in a quarter. So you would probably make a little component for each one of those in that row. Then, given the fact that my kids are, let's say, going to be working on summarizing and comparing and contrasting and author's purpose, then what prerequisites do students need to know? For instance, in summarizing, I need to be able to know who were the main characters, what did they do, what was the problem, and how did it get solved. So I'm going to be making sure that my team and I have outlined those. Think about them as being the big nuggets to get you to the point where kids know and understand the concepts that you have outlined in that first row. The third row talks about how much time is this going to take, because this is the part that is totally dependent on your children and where they are coming to, their point of entry. And so in that row 3, I would think about, what is it that I'm going to have to spend a lot of time on? At this point in the year, my kids may be able to tell you the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story and draw pictures and label it, and we have got that under control. So summarizing into one sentence or a short phrase, that's not going to take us so much time. Conversely, if those are not firm, or we sense that writing, getting one's thoughts down is still problematic, that's going to take us longer. And so this is line 3 that sort of says, this is where it gets real. I might be expected to cover these 3 topics, but here's the amount of time I'm going to have to dole out to each one of those. In row 4, the question calls for you to identify the vocabulary. And I want you to explore your curriculum documents, but I'm going to tell you 3 really big ones for quarter 3 are to understand author's purpose, that word, author and purpose, or that phrase. Then also the phrase compare and contrast, and the phrase summarize. So in that row 4, you're taking a look not at story vocabulary, or vocabulary even that's dependent on historical fiction, but you're looking at the academic vocabulary that comes from those critical skills that you said kids need to know in this quarter. In row 5, the specific teaching strategies refer to the strategies such as inferring, determining importance, both of which would be featured this particular quarter. Inferring because if we're going to make a guess about why an author wrote something, or we're going to evaluate that author's credibility or that their information is credible or not, I'm inferring. I'm based on criteria that the teacher has given. Determining importance is a huge part of summarizing. So I can tell you that those 2 strategies stream through the grade levels this particular quarter. And in 6, it talks about habits of mind. Here's a piece that I know in my own planning I didn't think about so much, but it was, do my kids ask questions spontaneously? Do I give them a space and a time for that? That's the row where you start to think about, wow, my kids shut down pretty fast. I'm going to work on what it means to struggle with something and how it feels, and I'm going to talk to them about that. Or another piece that could fit here would be about independence. And another one could be, learners ask questions all the time. And we're really going to think hard about what we're learning this quarter, and I want you to ask tons of questions. Let me show you how that's done. as we get ready to start that planning process, and you start to think about how can I engage students in active learning, inquiry, which we have defined as play. Play looks differently in our youngest learners of 3 and 4 years old than it does in our 8 and 9 years old, 7, 8, 9-year-old in second grade. It looks differently, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. The context of learning has to be around that play, and if it is, amazing things can happen, and they can happen in a really fun way. And we do a wonderful thing for kids that teaches them that learning is truly an interactive process, and not that process that's just sort of the Charlie Brown teacher talking at us, where we have a chance to mess around with, to play both inside of books and inside of topics to explore the things that interest us. So it is to boldly go off today in this session and to explore those curriculum pieces that will support you in this endeavor, but then, most importantly, to have those conversations with your team members that will help you to uncover both situations and activities that will encourage students to play with their learning. Have a great time planning. Bye.